My name is Elena. I am 50 years old. The night a stranger looked at my husband across a table and told him that his wife had just described one of the most significant logistics case studies of the last 15 years. David's face did something I had never seen it do in 23 years of marriage. He went completely still, not the stillness of embarrassment, not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man who understood for the first time that he had been telling a story about someone he didn't actually know, and the person he didn't know was sitting right next to him. She had been sitting right next to him for more than 2 decades. He looked at me the way you look at a wall in your own house when you realize there's a door in it that you missed. I'm going to tell you how we got there. But first, I want you to understand something about the nature of the work I did for 22 years. Because without that, none of the rest of it makes any sense. Logistics is invisible by design. Every single success in logistics looks exactly the same from the outside. It looks like nothing happened, the supplies arrived, the men ate, the vehicles had fuel, the ammunition was where it needed to be. Nobody stood in a field in the middle of a failing operation and said, well, clearly someone worked very hard to make this not a catastrophe. They said, good, the ammunition's here, and they went back to their work. And they should have. That's exactly what success looks like. I understood that from my first day in uniform. I chose that invisibility. I built my career inside it. What I didn't plan for was that the invisibility would follow me home. I was born in San Antonio, the second of 4 children. My father worked in construction management, and my mother taught 3rd grade for 31 years. Neither of them had military backgrounds, but both of them had the particular discipline of people who understand that the work itself is the point. You do not talk about what you built. You point at what is standing. That was the lesson of my childhood. And it settled into me so deeply that I sometimes forget other people receive different lessons. Other people were taught to announce their accomplishments. Other people learned that if you don't tell your own story, no one will tell it for you. I was taught that results speak, and you let them. 22 years in the Marine Corps reinforced that lesson every single day. I entered officer candidate school at 22 years old, commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant, and was assigned to the logistics branch. I spent the next 2 decades moving supplies through environments that were not designed to accommodate movement. I deployed 4 times. 2 of those deployments were to active combat zones where the logistics chain was not a neat organizational chart, but a living system under constant pressure, constantly breaking down, constantly requiring improvisation and relationships and solutions that existed in the space between the official procedures and the actual facts on the ground. I was good at operating in that space. I was very good at it. But I never talked about it the way you talk about something you're proud of, because pride was not the frame I used. The frame I used was, did the mission succeed? If it did, move on. If it didn't, figure out what failed and fix it for next time. The deployment that mattered most happened when I was 36 years old, a major with 14 years of service and 2 previous combat deployments under my belt. We were supporting a regimental scale operation in a region where the primary logistics routes had been compromised faster than anyone anticipated. The situation developed in a way that hadn't been fully gamed out in planning. Within 72 hours of the operation's start, 3 of our 4 primary supply corridors were either physically impassable or tactically untenable. We had 2,200 Marines in the field who needed food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. We had a timeline of, at minimum, 11 days before alternative corridors could be formally established and certified. And we had a logistics chain that had, for all practical purposes, stopped working. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I've told this story very few times, and I've learned that people hear it differently depending on what they already believe about logistics work. Some people hear it and think I'm describing a miracle. I'm not. Miracles imply the absence of mechanism. What I did was entirely mechanical. It was problem solving at a very specific level under very specific pressure. But it required knowing things that weren't written down anywhere and trusting relationships that weren't in any official chain of command. And it required making decisions in a window of about 4 hours that would have taken a normal authorization process 4 days to approve. The situation in the hours immediately after the corridors collapsed was not chaotic, which surprises people when I describe it. Chaos would have been easier in some ways. Chaos is loud and obvious and commands immediate attention. What we had instead was a very quiet, very precise problem with a very precise timeline. I knew exactly how many Marines were in the field. I knew exactly what their daily consumption requirements were in terms of ammunition, water, food, and fuel. I knew exactly how many days we had before the situation moved from logistically difficult to operationally catastrophic. And I knew from 14 years of experience working in the space between what logistics doctrine says is possible and what actual logistics practice makes possible, that somewhere in the gap between those two things, there was a solution. My job in those first 4 hours was not to panic and not to escalate before I had something concrete to offer. My job was to find the shape of the solution before I told anyone it existed. What I did was this. I identified 7 alternative supply pathways that existed in the gap between official logistics doctrine and the actual geography of what was in front of us. 3 of those pathways involved informal coordination with local contractors that our command had used for different purposes in the past but had never officially classified as supply routes. 2 involved rerouting through adjacent units' areas of operation in ways that were technically outside our authorization but were achievable with a phone call to the right people in those units, people I had worked with and trusted. 1 involved a combination of air assets and ground transport that had never been used in that configuration before, but that I was reasonably certain would work because I had spent 4 months in planning, seeing exactly what assets were available and where. The 7th pathway was the one I was least certain about, but it ended up being the one that moved the most volume. I coordinated those 7 pathways simultaneously over a period of roughly 18 hours. I slept for 90 minutes in a folding chair. I drank more coffee than is medically advisable. I have a lower back that has never forgiven me for the physical conditions of that particular stretch of time. Though, to be fair, the lower back injury actually predated that deployment by 2 years, a result of a vehicle rollover on my second tour that healed imperfectly and has provided me with a consistent reminder ever since that the body keeps its own record. By the time the sun came up on day 2, supplies were moving. By the end of day 3, all 7 pathways were functional to some degree. For 11 days, 2,200 Marines had what they needed. The operation succeeded. And when it was over, I wrote my after-action report, submitted it through the chain, and started planning for the next requirement. 2 officers in my chain of command submitted me for commendation. The citations described, in the careful language of military formal documentation, what I had done. They used words like exceptional initiative and demonstrated superior judgment under operational stress and coordinated logistics support through non-standard means with direct impact on mission success. Those documents exist. They are part of my official record. They were submitted years before David and I got married, and I mentioned them to him once, early in our relationship, in the way you mention the broad outlines of something. When someone asks about your service record, I said, I got commended for some logistics work during a difficult operation. He said, that's great. And I said, yes. And we moved on to other things because we were new and there were other things to talk about. And I didn't think the details mattered in the way they turn out to have mattered. David and I met when I was 39 and he was 41. I had finished my 4th deployment and was assigned to a training and doctrine role in San Antonio. He was a software engineer who had just relocated there for a job with a technology company, and we met at a barbecue hosted by a mutual friend. He was funny and precise, and he asked good questions. He is still all of those things. He has a mind that genuinely enjoys problems, which is one of the reasons I fell in love with him. He builds systems that other people use without knowing they exist, which is, now that I think about it, not entirely unlike what I did. The difference is that software engineers tend to talk about what they've built. There's a whole professional culture around it. David can take something abstract and technical and make it legible to anyone in the room, which is a genuine skill and one that serves him well at dinner parties and at company events and anywhere else where the story you tell about your work determines how people understand your value. I admired that about him then, and I admire it still. He earned those stories. He built those systems. He has every right to describe them. The problem was not that David talked about his work. The problem was what happened when people asked about mine. It started gradually, the way most patterns start. In the early months of our relationship, he would say Elena was in the Marines for 22 years. She ran logistics. When people followed up with, "What does that mean?" he would look at me and I would give the short version, which sounded less impressive than the short version of his work because his work produced things with visible interfaces and mine produced things with no interface at all. You can show someone a software product. You can demo it. You can point at a screen and say, "See, this is what I built." You cannot show someone an 11-day logistics operation that succeeded by accessing channels that don't officially exist. You can only describe it, and a description requires a listener who already has a framework for understanding what they're being told. David didn't have that framework. I never gave it to him, which I understand now was a mistake. But at the time, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the correct approach. He was not my commanding officer. He was not reviewing my performance. He was my husband. And the details of my career felt like work. And when I came home from work, I had always, as a matter of psychological survival, left work at the door as much as possible. That's a habit that serves you well in uniform and causes problems when you're trying to share your life with someone who is trying to understand you. So the short version got shorter. And then David started filling in the gaps himself, the way people do when they're in a relationship with someone who doesn't offer much. And the way he filled in the gaps reflected the mental image he'd assembled from scattered details. I was in logistics. Logistics, as most civilians understand it, means paperwork and supply rooms and inventory systems. He had been to a Marine Corps base once, early in our relationship, and the thing that made the biggest impression on him was the supply depot, the organized rows, the documentation, the precision of the inventory. He came home and said, "It's incredibly organized." And I said, "Yes, that's the point." And he heard confirmation that what I did was fundamentally about organization and documentation, which is true the way it's true that what a surgeon does is fundamentally about cutting and sewing. By the time we moved to Austin, which was 5 years into our marriage, the version David told at parties had fully calcified. He would say, "She spent her career making sure supplies got where they needed to go," which is technically accurate. He would say it was a lot of coordination, a lot of paperwork, which is technically not inaccurate. He would say the military runs on logistics and logistics officers are the ones who keep track of everything, which sounds like a compliment and is, in practice, a way of describing a librarian rather than someone who kept a regiment alive for 11 days in a collapsing operational environment. I heard him say these things and I did not correct him. And eventually, I'm not sure I even noticed anymore. It had just become the story of my career as understood by the person who shared my life. The Friday evening of the dinner party, I had spent most of the afternoon cooking. Diane, who lives next door and who retired from the Army Military Police after 20 years and who has, in my honest assessment, one of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered, wrapped in the most aggressively casual packaging I've ever encountered, had offered to bring things, and I had taken her up on it because Diane's potato salad is, without any exaggeration, the best potato salad I have ever eaten, and I have eaten potato salad on 4 continents. She showed up at 4 in the afternoon with the potato salad, a bottle of wine, and the specific energy she always brings, which is the energy of a woman who has seen everything and is mildly amused by most of it. Kevin arrived at 6. Kevin is David's older brother, a financial analyst in Houston. Pleasant, well-intentioned, the kind of person who asks polite questions at family dinners because he genuinely wants to be a good guest. His wife, Patricia, brought flowers, which I put in a vase, and their two teenage sons immediately migrated to the corner of the living room where David's television is located, which suited everyone fine. We ate early. The potato salad was, as predicted, exceptional. The conversation moved around the table in the pleasant, directionless way family conversations do, covering work, the boys' school, the traffic in Houston, the weather in Austin in summer, which is a topic that sustains entire evenings if you let it. And then Kevin asked the question. He had been asking David about a project, something about a platform migration that had taken 14 months and had, in David's telling, involved a number of interesting technical decisions. And at some point, the conversation turned in my direction. And Kevin said, Elena, I realize I've never actually asked you, what did you do in the Marines exactly? Not the short version. What was a normal day like? I was in the kitchen getting more ice. I could hear the conversation clearly through the window above the sink. David answered before I could come back. He said, oh, she was in supply and logistics, making sure all the equipment got where it needed to go, a lot of coordination work. Honestly, she spent most of her career pushing paper in supply depots, making sure everything was accounted for. Very important work, but not the most exciting job in the world. I stood at the sink with my hand on the ice tray, pushing paper. I thought about the 18 hours I had spent in a folding chair rerouting a collapsing supply chain through 7 unofficial pathways while 2,200 Marines waited in the field. I thought about the phone calls I had made at 2 a.m. to people in adjacent units who had no obligation to help me and who helped me anyway, because I had spent years building the kind of professional relationships that hold up under that kind of pressure. I thought about the after-action citations that described what I had done in formal military language that I had never read to David out loud. I thought about the fact that I had, in all honesty, never read them to David out loud, never handed him the documents, never said, sit down, I want to tell you what actually happened. I put the ice in the pitcher. I went back to the table. I sat down and I said, Kevin, do you want to hear about the time the entire primary logistics chain collapsed during a critical operation, and I had to figure out how to feed and supply 2,200 Marines for 11 days using routes that technically didn't exist? Kevin said, absolutely. David looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I told the short version. I've always told the short version. I said the primary corridors failed. I found alternate pathways. The supplies got through. Kevin said, that sounds incredibly stressful. I said it was fine. You focus on the problem. Diane, sitting across from me, was watching my face with the careful attention she always gives to conversations that are about something other than what they appear to be about. She didn't say anything. She refilled my wine. After Kevin and Patricia and the boys left, and after David had gone to bed, I sat on the back porch with Diane for an hour. The Austin night had cooled to something manageable, which in summer is its own small miracle. She had her feet up on the railing, and I had my back against a cushion because my back had decided that evening to remind me of its grievances, which it does periodically and without sympathy. She said, how long has he been saying that? I said, saying what? She gave me the look she reserves for when I'm being deliberately obtuse. I said, a while. She said, and you've never corrected him. I said, it's not inaccurate. I did coordinate paperwork. I did work in supply depots. She said, Elena? I said, I know. She said, you know what happens when you never tell people what you actually did? I said, they assume the easiest version. She said, they assume the easiest version, and then they repeat it, and then it becomes the true version. And then you end up sitting on your back porch annoyed about a version of events you constructed by your own silence. I said, whose side are you on? She said, yours, obviously, which is why I'm telling you the truth. Diane has this quality that I have always appreciated about her, which is that she has no interest in telling you things that make you feel good at the expense of things that are actually useful. She was 21 years in the Army MP before she retired. And she has a clarity of perception that comes from spending 2 decades dealing with people in situations where the gap between what they say and what's actually happening is frequently the most important information in the room. She can read a situation faster than almost anyone I've known. She reads me faster than almost anyone I've known. She said, "When's the last time you told David the real version of something you did in uniform?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I don't know." She said, "I do. Never." I said, "That's not true." She said, "Elena, I have had more detailed conversations with you about your deployments in this backyard over the last 4 years than your husband has had with you in the house behind us." And I don't say that to make you feel bad. I say that because I think you've decided that telling him is not worth the effort of translating it into terms he'll understand. And I think that's a mistake. I didn't answer right away. The night was doing the thing it sometimes does in Austin in late summer, where the air stops moving entirely and the heat sits heavy and still, and you can hear the insects very clearly. I sat with what she'd said. I said, "He doesn't have the frame for it." She said, "Then give him the frame. That's what you do. You're a logistics officer. You build the delivery system first, and then you move the supplies. You haven't built the delivery system." I thought about that for a long time after she went home. The thing is, she was right. She was exactly right. And I knew it, and knowing it was not the same as knowing what to do about it. Because by the time she sat on my back porch and said that to me, the pattern had been established for years. David had a version of my career that was wrong in a specific and significant way, and I had allowed it to calcify. And I had done that partly out of habit and partly out of the particular brand of stubbornness that my mother would say I inherited from my grandfather, who once refused to tell anyone he had a broken arm for 3 weeks because he didn't want to make a fuss. I come from people who do not make fusses. I am, it turns out, sometimes too loyal to that inheritance. What I told myself, sitting on the back porch after Diane left, was that I would find a way to tell him, that I would pick a good moment, that I would sit down with him and say, "I want to tell you something about what I actually did because I think you've been operating on incomplete information and that's my fault." I told myself I would do that. 6 weeks passed. In those 6 weeks, I went to the gym 4 times a week because the only thing that reliably helps my lower back is a consistent combination of strength work and stretching, a fact I resisted for years and have now accepted with the resignation of someone who has stopped arguing with the evidence. I had lunch with Diane twice. I drove to San Antonio to see my mother, who at 77 remains the most organized person I have ever encountered in my life, which I now understand in a way I didn't when I was young is where I got it from. We sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee the way she always makes it, which is too strong and very good. And she asked about David and I said, fine. And she asked about my back and I said the same. And she said, "You look like someone who is waiting for something." And I said, "I'm just tired." And she nodded in the way she nods when she thinks you're not telling her everything but has decided not to press. My mother is a third-grade teacher who retired after 31 years, and she has a classroom full of precision that she deploys selectively. She deployed it selectively that afternoon. David and I had dinner 3 nights a week at home and watched television and talked about his project and what was happening with the neighbors and whether we should finally get the roof assessed. The way people who have built a life together talk about the components of that life. It was good. It is good. That's not nothing. But I hadn't found the moment. The event where I met James Whitfield was a fundraiser for a veterans support organization. David's company was a sponsor. He went to these events several times a year, and I went with him when I wasn't doing something else. And that particular evening, I wasn't doing something else. The venue was a hotel ballroom in downtown Austin, the kind of event that features cocktail tables and a silent auction and a program with a speaker and a video that makes most people in the room cry. I wore the navy dress I've had for 8 years that still works, and I put my hair up and my back was behaving itself that evening, which I took as a good sign. David was in his element at these events. He's naturally social in a way that I am not, which is to say that networking comes easily to him and requires effort from me. He moves through rooms with an ease I have always admired and a certain mild pleasure in connecting people who might be useful to each other, which is a genuinely generous impulse and not a calculating one. He introduced me to several people during the cocktail hour in the way he always does, as his wife, Elena, she's retired military. And then the conversation would move to his project or his company's work with the foundation. And I would stand there and smile, and that was fine. We had found our seats for dinner when a man stopped at the table and spoke to one of David's colleagues. And David's colleague introduced him around the table. And when he got to me, he said, "This is Elena Torres. She's a retired Marine, logistics officer, 22 years. The man sat down in the empty seat next to me. His name was James Whitfield. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with the particular posture of someone who spent a significant portion of his life in uniform and never entirely let it go. He had been a Navy Supply Corps officer for 25 years, he told me, retiring as a commander, and was now the chief executive officer of Continental Logistics Group, which I knew by reputation as one of the larger private logistics consulting firms in the country. He had built it from a small operation into something substantial over 18 years, and the reason I knew his company's name was that they were cited in two of the logistics training documents I had reviewed during my last assignment. There are not many people in a ballroom full of software engineers and nonprofit administrators and technology executives who will know that. He registered the recognition in my face, and his expression shifted slightly in the way it shifts when someone in the industry encounters someone who is also in the industry. That small adjustment of the social register that happens when you realize you don't have to explain the basics. He asked where I'd served. I told him. He asked what my specialty was within logistics. I told him I had spent most of my career in operational logistics support, which is the unglamorous end of the field where you're not designing systems but executing them in conditions that don't cooperate. He said he knew exactly what that meant, and that in his experience, the people who worked that end were the ones who actually kept things moving when the designed system stopped cooperating. I said yes, that was more or less the job description. He asked if I'd done any operational work in a specific region. He named it. I said yes, I had 2 deployments there. He asked which years. I told him. He set down his glass. He said, "Were you involved in any way with the regimental supply recovery operation in the early part of the second deployment?" He named the operation. The formal name of the operation, I said yes. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "In what capacity?" I said, "I was the logistics officer responsible for coordinating the alternate supply pathways." He was quiet for several seconds. Not an uncomfortable silence, a considering silence. He said, "The report on that operation has been in my case study files for almost 15 years. I've used elements of it in my company's training program for over a decade. The improvised multi-pathway coordination model, the informal channel integration, the real-time rerouting under operational constraints. We use that case as an example of what genuinely skilled logistics management looks like under complete primary system failure." He paused. He said, "The report doesn't name the coordinating officer. The way it's written, I always assumed it was a team effort led by someone at the colonel level." I said, "It was a team effort. I had good people." He said, "Who led the coordination?" I said, "I did." He set down his glass again. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The 7th pathway, the one that moved the highest volume in the final 5 days of the operation. The documentation on that one is sparse. The report describes the pathway generally, but not the specific mechanism. I've been curious about it for years because on paper it shouldn't have worked at all given the asset availability at that point in the operation." I said, "It shouldn't have worked on paper." He waited. I said, "There was a Marine warrant officer in the adjacent sector who had a working relationship with a civilian contractor the official records didn't account for. The contractor had assets that weren't in any inventory I had access to because they were being held in reserve for a different purpose. I called the warrant officer. The warrant officer called the contractor. The contractor agreed to redirect the assets on the condition that we handled the documentation in a way that protected him from certain contractual complications. I made a judgment call about the documentation. The supplies moved. James Whitfield said, "You made a judgment call about the documentation." I said, "Yes." He said, "Meaning you found a legal but unconventional way to document a supply arrangement that technically sat outside standard procurement procedures in order to protect the contractor's position while still completing the movement." I said, "That's a fair description." He said, "In real time, under operational pressure, without the ability to consult your chain of command." I said, "There wasn't time to consult the chain of command." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at David, who was sitting 2 seats down and had been following the conversation with the attentive expression of someone who understands that something significant is happening without yet understanding what it is. James Whitfield said, "I'm sorry. Can you start from the beginning? I want to hear this from the start. I may want to use the full account in my training program, if you're willing." I looked at David. He was watching me. I told it from the beginning, not the short version, not the version I tell in polite company at events when someone asks what I did in the Marines, the real version, the 72 hours of corridor collapse, the 4-hour window, the 7 pathways and what each one required. The phone calls and the relationships and the decisions made in the space between official procedure and operational reality. The warrant officer and the contractor and the documentation judgment, the 18 hours in the folding chair, the 90 minutes of sleep, the 11 days and 2,200 Marines, and the supplies that got there. James Whitfield did not interrupt me. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the second pathway, which was the one involving the adjacent units, because he was trying to understand the specific authorization framework I was working within and how I managed the risk of operating outside my formal area. I explained it. He nodded. He asked about the decision timeline for the documentation question, which was the most sensitive part and the one that had always lived in the uncomfortable space between what I did and what I could fully defend in writing. I explained that too. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you understand what you just described?" I said, "I know what I did." He said, "I've been in logistics for 40 years. I've worked in the Navy. I've built a private company that operates in 31 countries. I've consulted with government agencies on supply chain resilience and crisis logistics. I have studied this field professionally for the entirety of my adult life." He stopped. He said, "What you're describing is not standard practice. It's not advanced practice. It's what happens when someone has internalized the entire system so thoroughly that they can see the shape of a solution that doesn't exist yet and build it before anyone else understands that a solution is needed. That is an exceptionally rare capability." I said, "I had good people." He said, "I'm sure you did, but that decision about the documentation, specifically, that's not something good people do. That's not something most senior officers do. That's something a person with a specific kind of operational intelligence does. The kind of judgment that comes from understanding not just what the rules say, but what the rules are for, and making a call about when the purpose of the rule supersedes the letter of it in real time without a safety net." He turned to David. He said, "Do you know what your wife just described?" David said, "I think so." James Whitfield said, "I don't think you do." He said it without unkindness. He said it the way you say something you are certain is true. He said, "Your wife just described one of the most sophisticated operational logistics decisions I have ever heard described in person. I've read the report. I've studied the report. I've taught from elements of the report. I never knew who made those calls." He looked back at me. He said, "I would like to use this account, with your permission, as the central case study in the senior level module of our training program. It's the first complete account I've had of what actually happened. The reports describe outcomes. You've just described mechanism. That's significantly more valuable. I said, I need to review what you're planning to present before I agreed. He said, of course. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, which he held out to me. He said, call me next week. I want to have a longer conversation. David was very quiet for the rest of dinner. On the drive home, he didn't say anything for the first several minutes. I watched the Austin streets go by in the dark. My back was starting to register the fact that I'd been sitting in event chairs for 4 hours, which it always does. And I was thinking about the heating pad in the closet and also about the fact that my husband had just heard someone describe his wife's career for the first time, 23 years into knowing her, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. He said, I didn't know about the operation. I said, I know. He said, you never told me. I said, I told you I got commended for logistics work during a difficult deployment. He said, Elena? I said, I know. He drove for another block. He said, 2,200 Marines. I said, yes. He said, and the primary chain collapsed. I said, within 72 hours, 3 of 4 corridors. He said, and you fixed it. I said, with a lot of help. He said, in 18 hours. I said, the initial stabilization took about 18 hours. The full system took 3 days. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, I told Kevin you pushed paper. I said, I heard you. He said, I heard myself say it, and I didn't think anything was wrong with it. I've been saying things like that for years, at parties and at dinners and to my family, and I have been describing you as someone who processed supply orders, and I heard myself say it that Friday, and I thought nothing was wrong with it. I said, I never corrected you. He said, I know, but I also never asked. I never asked the real version. I asked you once in the beginning and you gave me a summary and I took the summary and I've been working from the summary for the entire time I've known you. I said, you would have needed context to understand the summary. He said, then you should have given me the context. He paused. He said, you should have built the delivery system first. I looked at him. He said, I'm a software engineer. I know the difference between a summary and a specification. I should have known to ask for the specification, but you should have known that a summary wasn't enough. I said, Diane told me the same thing. He said, when? I said, 6 weeks ago. He said, 6 weeks ago. I said, yes. He said, and you didn't tell me then either. I said, I was looking for the right moment. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said, the right moment is not a thing that arrives. I know this about myself, and apparently I don't know it about you yet. The right moment is a thing you manufacture. We pulled into the driveway. He turned off the engine, and we sat in the car in the dark with the engine ticking as it cooled. He said, I want the real version. I said, of what? He said, of your career. All of it. Not the summary. The version you gave James Whitfield tonight. The version where the system breaks and you find a way through it anyway. I want that version. I said, that's going to take a while. He said, I have time. I said, David. He said, Elena. I said, you told Kevin I pushed paper. He said, I know. I said, you've been telling some version of that for years. He said, I know. I said, and you never thought to ask. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I thought you would have told me if there was something worth telling. I thought I knew the size of the thing. I said, you thought logistics was paperwork. He said, I thought logistics was paperwork, and you didn't disabuse me of that notion. And I should have pushed harder and you should have offered more. And we ended up with a version of your career that sounds like filing. And I told my brother about it at a dinner party. And you stood in the kitchen and heard me do it. And you came back to the table and you were very composed, which is how you always are. And I had no idea anything was wrong until a man I'd never met told me at a fundraiser that my wife had just described one of the most significant logistics cases he had studied in 15 years. I said, he was being generous. He said, was he? I thought about it. I said, probably not. He said, tell me about the seventh pathway. I said, we should go inside. He said, tell me about the seventh pathway. I looked at him in the dark of the car. His face was doing the same thing it had done at the dinner table when James Whitfield was talking. The stillness, the specific stillness of someone recalibrating. I told him about the seventh pathway. I told him about the warrant officer, whose name was Rodriguez, who had a laugh like a thunderstorm and who once helped me move 600 pounds of medical supplies through a corridor that officially did not exist by the simple expedient of having opinions about paperwork that I found professionally compatible with my own. I told him about the contractor, a man of late middle age who wore the same green jacket every day and who had been working in that region for 11 years and who understood the landscape, literal and logistical, with a precision that no satellite image could replicate. I told him about the phone call at 2:40 in the morning, the negotiation conducted in a mixture of English and fragments of a language I spoke badly, and the contractor spoke perfectly. The terms worked out in real time. The judgment call about the documentation that I had made and stood behind and would make again. David listened. He did not interrupt. He asked one question, which was about the documentation. And it was a good question, the specific kind of precise question that the mind he has produces when it is genuinely engaged with a problem. I answered it. He nodded. When I finished, we sat in the driveway for a moment. He said, I want to apologize. I said, you don't need to. He said, I do. Not for not knowing. I want to apologize for not asking, for taking the summary, for deciding that the summary was the complete picture. That was lazy in a way that I don't like being. And I did it for years. And you heard me do it in front of Kevin, and I'm sorry. I said, I should have told you. He said, yes, but I should have wanted to know. Those are different things, and both of them are true. We went inside. My back had graduated from manageable to insistent. So I got the heating pad from the closet and sat on the couch, and David made tea without being asked, which is something he does when he's processing something and needs his hands busy. He brought 2 cups and sat next to me, and I told him the rest of it. Not just the seventh pathway, the rest of the career, the first deployment and the second and the third and the fourth. The things that went wrong and the things I fixed and the things I couldn't fix and the 2 people whose faces I still see sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. The injuries and the decisions and the long stretches of time away and what it costs to be the person who makes sure supplies get there and what it means when they don't. He listened. He asked good questions. He was quiet in the places where quiet was the right response. It took most of the night. My tea went cold. His went cold. Outside, the Austin night eventually shifted toward morning, the sky going from black to the particular gray that comes before actual light, and at some point I realized I had been talking for almost 3 hours and that I was not tired. He said, you know what the hardest part is to hear? I said, what? He said, you've been carrying all of this, all of it, for the entire time I've known you. And I was the person you came home to, and I never carried any of it with you because I didn't know it was there. I said, that's not your fault. He said, it's partly my fault, and it's partly yours. And I think we should probably try to do better at this. I said, probably. He said, starting with the fact that I'm going to call Kevin tomorrow and give him a significantly different description of your career. I said, you don't have to do that. He said, Elena, I told my brother you pushed paper. I said, technically I did push some paper. He said, I'm going to call Kevin. I let him. Diane came over the following Saturday morning with coffee and no explanation, which is her standard operating procedure, and one of the reasons I've considered her one of my closest friends since she moved in next door 4 years ago. She sat at the kitchen table and I poured the coffee and she waited. I told her about the event. I told her about James Whitfield. I told her about the drive home and the conversation in the car and the 3 hours on the couch. She said, "You told him about the seventh pathway." I said, "I told him about the seventh pathway." She said, "How did that feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Like setting down something heavy that you've been carrying so long you forgot it was in your hands?" She said, "Yeah, that's about right." She drank her coffee. I drank mine. Outside, the neighborhood was doing its Saturday morning things. Someone mowing, a car backing out of a driveway, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day. She said, "What did he say when you were done?" I said, "He said we should try to do better." She said, "That's a good answer." I said, "I thought so." She said, "And what are you going to do about the commission from Whitfield?" I said, "I'm going to call him this week. I want to see what he's planning to present before I agree to anything. If it's accurate and useful and doesn't require me to say anything I'm not comfortable saying, I'll consider it." She said, "You're going to let them use your case study." I said, "I'm going to think about letting them use my case study." She said, "Elena." I said, "I'm going to let them use my case study." She nodded. I called James Whitfield on Wednesday. We talked for almost 2 hours. He sent me the existing case study materials and I read them carefully, and they were largely accurate in outcome but sparse in mechanism, exactly as he had described. What he wanted was the mechanism, the real decision framework, the how of it, not just the what. He wanted to teach logistics officers, both military and civilian, what it actually looks like when someone with complete operational knowledge makes a judgment call in real time with inadequate information and gets it right. He wanted to teach that it was teachable, that it wasn't magic, that it was the result of years of building relationships and understanding systems deeply enough to see their shape when they break. I said, "I can do that." He said, "I was hoping you'd say that. I am not, at 50 years old, someone who spends a great deal of time looking backward. The back looks backward for me physically with sufficient commentary to fill most reflection requirements. But I've thought about that season of my life more than I usually think about things. And what I keep coming back to is this: there is a version of competence that protects itself by being invisible. It never announces. It never explains. It trusts that the results will speak and that the people around it will be capable of reading what the results say. That version of competence is not wrong about what it values. The results do speak. The mission did succeed. 2,200 Marines ate and had ammunition and water for 11 days because someone found 7 pathways through a broken system. That happened. The result is real regardless of whether anyone outside the chain of command could read it. But the version of competence that protects itself by being invisible also protects other people from seeing clearly. My husband could not have known what he didn't know. He built a mental model from the information available to him, and the information available to him was the summary I provided and the silence I maintained and the story he told himself to fill in the gaps. That's what people do. They fill in the gaps. The gaps I left were large enough to fit an entirely wrong understanding of 22 years of my life, and I filled them for him with silence and then was quietly, persistently annoyed when the story he told was wrong. I keep thinking about what James Whitfield said. The report describes outcomes. You've just described mechanism. That's significantly more valuable. He was talking about logistics training, but I think about it in a different context sometimes. The outcome of my career is visible if you know how to look at it. The mechanism of how I became the person who could do that work, the deployments and the decisions and the relationships built at 2 a.m. under operational pressure, that's what I never described. Not to David, not to most people, not because it was secret, because I had decided somewhere early in my career and never consciously reconsidered that mechanism was not the point. That results were the only thing that mattered, and that the path to results was, by definition, already passed. I had made peace with that logic so completely that I didn't notice I was applying it in places where it didn't belong. What I know now, at 50, that I did not know at 36 or 40 or even 48, is that the people who love you deserve the mechanism. Not because they need to validate you or because you need to be seen or because the story is impressive and impressive stories deserve audiences, for a simpler reason than any of those, because the mechanism is where you actually live. The outcome is where you used to be. The mechanism is the ongoing thing. The process of finding 7 pathways through a broken system is not something that happened once during a collapsing operation. It is something I do in every part of my life. It is how I think. It is how I solved the problem of my husband not knowing me. Not by announcing anything, not by correcting him publicly, by finding the conversation that didn't officially exist yet and building it in real time with the person who was willing to sit in the driveway in the dark and ask for the real version. David called Kevin. Kevin called me to apologize, which I told him was completely unnecessary, and he did anyway, which is a Kevin thing to do and not unpleasant. David has come to 2 of James Whitfield's company training sessions, which he was not required to attend and attended anyway. He has, I gather, talked to several of the participants. He has, according to Diane, who has heard things I have chosen not to verify, told James Whitfield's staff that his wife is one of the best problem solvers he has ever encountered and that he took him an embarrassingly long time to figure that out. I drive an old truck that I refuse to replace. I drink more coffee than is advisable. I arrive places slightly too early and then sit in the parking lot because arriving exactly on time makes me uncomfortable. My back reports its grievances on a regular schedule, particularly in cold weather and after event chairs and long car trips, and I have learned to carry a heating pad and accept that this is simply part of the ongoing conversation between my body and the choices I made with it over 22 years. These things have not changed. What has changed is that when someone asks David what his wife did in the Marines, he doesn't answer before I can. He looks at me. He says, "You should hear this from her." And I tell the version that is not a summary, the version with the mechanism, the version that starts with 72 hours in a collapsing supply chain and ends with 7 pathways through a system that had technically stopped working. It takes a while to tell it. I've learned not to mind that. The most dramatic logistic story is the one where nothing visibly goes wrong. The supply lines held. The men ate. The ammunition arrived. Nobody made a movie about it. That is exactly what success looks like. But the people who love you deserve to know how the supply lines held, because how it happened is where you actually live, and they are trying, if you let them, to live there with you.